Furedi TV. The world is thinking.
I'm delighted to be introducing Frank Furedi, a Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent, and to have the opportunity to be here at his book launch of Invitation to Terror, The Expanding Empire of the Unknown, published by Continuum. So, the way in which we'd like to chair this session, to run this session, is to actually have a conversation for about 20 minutes about some of the key themes in the book, and then go out to the audience and take as many questions as possible from you. So firstly, Frank, I'd really like to, you've written a large number of books, from the study of the Mau Mau Rebellion, to Paranoid Parenting, to Where Have All the Intellectuals Gone, and The Politics of Fear, which was your most recent book last year. I was wondering, where does your new book, Invitation to Terror, fit into your canon, in a sense?
Well, when I began to work on terrorism, I was principally interested in the fact that there was a consensus that the world had changed, and that the 21st century was predominantly defined by what happened at 9/11, and that in many ways people argued that the world had not changed, the world will never be the same again. And in some sense that's true, because when you travel around the world, you do realize that something has changed, and there's something new that is in the air, and I wanted to investigate that. And I felt that initially when I began to do the work, I thought what I would discover is that terrorism and the fears about terrorism were very similar to some of the other fears that I talked about, and in some ways they are. But what happened was that when I got more and more into the subject, I realized that what people talked about, when they talked about terrorism, they talked about something that was very, very new and very, very different to the way that terrorism was conceived in the past. And I just want to explain what that means, because one of the key points that comes out of the book. See, in previous times, whenever people talked about terrorism, they always talked about something very specific. They talked about the ability to inflict terror. And they talked about the fact that these were people that were predominantly interested in inflicting fear upon the population and inflicting violence upon the population. That was its defining characteristics. And that's how terrorist organizations were distinguished from all the other political movements, radical movements, extremist movements throughout the world. But when you look at the discussion about terrorism today, you find that what worries governments isn't really their ability to inflict violence or to inflict terror, as the fact that these terrorists have got something that we are really worried about, and that something is their ideas. And I think what's very interesting is that if you listen to the speeches made by President Bush or Brown or Blair, they always make the point that the key dimension of the war on terror is that it's a battle of ideas. And that has never happened before. The government did not say that the key, the principal feature of the battle or the struggle against the IRA was that it was a battle of ideas. The government in Britain wasn't worried about the fact that the IRA's ideas would influence the population. And similarly, when the Red Brigades or the whatever they call in Germany, Meinhof movement, and by and large, the government sort of talk about these terrorists rather than their ideas. And I think the very fact that we're worried about their ideas, that we redefine terrorism in that kind of way, indicates that we're now talking about something very different than what traditional terrorism was. In fact, it's got nothing to do with terrorism in the way that it was traditionally defined. They're seen predominantly as an intellectual or an ideological competitor. And in the book, what I point out is that if that is the case, that's very worrying. Because basically what governments are saying is that these people are a threat, not simply because of the fact that they can kill and maim numbers of individuals. They are a source of worry because they got ideas that, in a sense, could potentially triumph. And our ideas may potentially give way to them. And that's what's interesting about the study that I've carried out. And I'm also very, very surprised that that point has been pointed out, that in fact we're not talking about an ideological opponent rather than simply a terrorist opponent in the way that it was seen in the past.
I guess my question following on from that then is, when we talk about they and their ideas, who is the they we're talking about? And are we talking about a coherent ideology? some would say political Islam. Do you think it is that, or?
Well, I think you raise a very important point, because President Bush, after 9/11, said, "Why do they hate us?" And we use the word "they" all the time. And one of the issues that I kind of deal with in the book is this. I think that President Bush, Prime Minister Blair, the governments of different European countries are not very sure about who they are. And I think that if you press the point, they will stutter and they will have genuine difficulties in explaining who they are. And sometimes they escape by blaming Al-Qaeda, which becomes this all-purpose shadowy network. Sometimes they talk about this and that group, but they, when you actually talk to people involved in the security business, they are very, very confused about who they are. But in the book, there's a discovery, my own intellectual discovery, which I was really shocked by, which is not only does President Bush and Blair and Brown and government are unclear about who they are, even more ominously, not really sure who we are. Right? When they say, "Why do they hate us?" it's not at all clear that they know who we are. And that comes out in the discussion on homegrown terrorism, because one of the things that comes out, I was talking to some German people recently, and they're saying, "My God, here are these blonde Germans, and they've converted to Islam, and now they're terrorists. And what's happening? Who are we? What are Europeans?" And I think that's really the whole issue, because if you don't know who they are, and we know who we are, then we got some problems.
Now, one of the things one of the things that I find striking about your book compared to various conspiracy theorists or authors recently is that you genuinely believe in the government's sincerity that there is an impending terrorist threat, and that they're not just playing a terrorist card to pass through various policies such as ID cards or things like that. The government, you argue, actually genuinely believes there's a terrorist threat and is trying to secure us against that. I was wondering if you have any comments, mainly on why there is such a prevalent culture of cynicism about in response to that kind of attitude.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. On every single issue, the government always says things are not as bad as you think they are. That's what they say about if there's a health problem, things are not that bad. We're in control. If there's a crash in education, things are not as bad as you fear. We're in control. And they said that about BSC. Every single scare, the government is a bit more restrained than the advocacy groups that are trying to create scares. Terrorism is the only exception. Terrorism is the only issue on which the public is more relaxed about, or more chilled out about than the government is. And if you talk to government people, they continue making the point: why does not the public understand the great dangers that exist here? And I think that to that extent, they genuinely do believe in the policies, which is not to say that they're not in the business of impression management, because quite often they have policies that they know will not work, but they think that it needs to be done to seem to work, because they fear that if they don't do anything, they're going to be discredited. But by and large, on the issue of terror, there's a sense in which they think that they know something that the rest of us don't know about, and something that needs to be done. And I put that down to the fact that governments, are experiencing a very profound motivational crisis, which comes to a head in relation to terror more than anything.
And now, this idea that they know something that we don't know about, I mean, it seems to me that actually they don't actually know what the threat will be, but that there will be an unknown threat that could be imposed upon us at any time. I'm wondering, this kind of feeds into your subtitle of the book, The Expanding Empire of the Unknown. And I was wondering if you could talk about why, what the empire of the unknown is, firstly, and secondly, why is the unknown seen as such a negative thing in this climate? I mean, in previous times, as you point out in your book, the unknown has actually been seen to be a great opportunity. The exploration of space, the exploration by European sailors of uncharted lands. Why now is it seen in such a negative light?
Well, I think that's the predominant cultural feature of our time, where we regard uncertainty as not an opportunity, not something we want to embrace, but as a potential danger and risk to our way of life. I think Donald Rumsfeld, really spelled this out most clearly when he made the point, first of all, about the the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in relation to weapons of mass destruction. And that's a very interesting argument. We're basically saying just because we don't have evidence doesn't mean that they don't have it. In fact, the very fact that we have evidence indicates that there's a real problem here. They're very crafty. They're very good at hiding this stuff. And in fact, if we had evidence, that wouldn't be as big a problem as not having the evidence. That's what he's saying. And he then went on to say that what he's really worried about is not what he knows, right? He's not worried about that. He's not even all that worried about what he doesn't know, the unknown. What he's really worried about are the unknown unknowns, those things that he doesn't know that he doesn't know. Because that's truly very, very dangerous. And in general, that's the way we tend to proceed. You know, sort of almost, if you look at this domain of cultural and social policy, we always worry about the unknown unknowns. So Bush said, you know, we are really worried about the fact that there is no, you know, we can't wait until the smoking gun. Because by the time there's a smoking gun, then Saddam Hussein would have gassed to death after New York. So we can't wait until there's a smoking gun. That's more or less the argument that environmentalists use, who, by the way, were the ones that invented the term unknown unknowns initially, about species extinction. Because when environmentalists argue, we cannot wait until all the pussycats die on the globe because of global warming. We cannot wait until, you know, the Arctic, you know, ice cap melts. We've got to do something now. We cannot wait. We must do something now. And the whole policy that we cannot wait, we must do something now. In other words, the policy of acting on what we don't know, rather than on what we do know, is a very interesting shift in policy making. You know, it's no longer knowledge-based, but rather, you know, sort of it's ignorance-based. I think ignorance becomes a very important driver of public policy, and it's got very destructive implications on terror, because, as I argue in the book, if you act on the basis of ignorance, you do actually create a terrorism problem in the end, because you almost invite terrorists to scare you even more. And in many ways, the problem of terrorism is not they who do the bad stuff, but the fact that we almost invite them, come here and scare us even more. You know, so that is the really, you know, to me, the really big danger in the future.
It's interesting that actually when terrorist attacks do occur, when the threat becomes kind of manifest in a sense, for example, after 9/11, you actually, or 9/11 indeed, you see the public being very resilient to this threat, to actually pick themselves up, to still travel on the tube, to still travel on buses, to help one another in the immediate aftermath of the threat. People demonstrate themselves to be robust in face of those kind of circumstances and not vulnerable. Yet you still get this this impending sense of vulnerability that, you know, we still need to fear these attacks and do everything we can to prepare against them. Why do you think that is?
Well, here is a very important point. I mean, just to give you an example, my partner is here, and one of her best friends was on one of the tubes that when the bombs went off in July 2005. And the way she tells the story, it became entirely dark. You know, so straight away became completely dark. And according to this woman's account, within 10 or 15 seconds, everybody in the tube was passing around water. You know, not behaving selfishly, not saying, I'm going to keep the water to myself. Forget about it. Everybody, all of a sudden, adopted what is a very responsible, sociable, altruistic form of behavior. And I think when I was talking to Anne's friend, I was really, you know, struck by the fact that here are people behaving almost entirely opposite to the official script, which is the Hollywood disaster film. You know, where towering inferno and all, you elbow out old people, you kind of trample over children. You know, all we do is care about number one. Really, that's the thing. And unfortunately, this dramatization of public response is the script that government policymakers work with. They actually imagine that you and I are so sort of, in a sense, degraded and so cowardly, and are so unable to behave responsibly that that's how we would behave. And that's the, you know, if you look at most of the assumptions that government first responders, emergency workers have in the back of their mind, is how do we prevent public panic? Public panic almost never happens, by the way, in a terrorist attack. You know, and that's one of the wonderful things. We learn to be, you know, real human beings under that kind of attacks, and we do unimaginably brave things, and we demonstrate unimaginable fortitude. And I think the reason why it's important to insist on this is because if we don't recognize this, but recognize the government script, we actually undermine our own ability to deal with these things. You see, history shows us that when people or communities face terror, they have an opportunity to come together. See, one of the things that has happened throughout history is that in a terrorist attack, you can have people being killed, and you can have people being maimed, you can have people losing their family members, you can have buildings being destroyed, a lot of money being lost. So physical capital is destroyed under a terrorist attack. You have human capital sometimes being destroyed under a terrorist attack. The most forms of capital diminish when you face an act of destruction. But there's one form of capital that doesn't get hurt, doesn't diminish, but may even increase, and that's social capital. That's one of the wonderful things, is that in communities can often become, learn to show the kind of solidarity towards one another that they were incapable of doing beforehand in the face of an attack. And quite often you will find that, that in London after July 2005, that even in New York after 9/11, that instead of people fragmenting and falling up in on themselves, they come together and there's more social capital afterwards than before. And that's why it's important that we recognize it, because if you have more social capital as a result of a terrorist attack, then that's an opportunity, an important opportunity to build something constructive, that's durable. But if you don't recognize that, then we just fritter away that social capital that's there, which is, I think, what a lot of the official policy encourages us to do. And the book is written to some extent as an attempt to balance that out.
I suppose one of my concerns is that actually the fear of the threat is in many ways greater than the threat itself. And as the terrorist attacks have actually been relatively few and far between, I guess we don't want to, like, for example, Naomi Klein says, wait until the next crisis to be able to have some kind of sense of a communal response to it. How do we actually counteract the fear, which I think in this instance is probably worse than the actual threat, rather than waiting for that kind of social moment afterwards, or kind of drawing upon those instances?
Well, I think ultimately, I see it as a philosophical question, because I think that in many respects, the reason why we're so confused about how to deal with this problem and the way and make all these mistakes is because this is really a battle of meaning. You know, what is the meaning of life? You know, what is the meaning in our community? And if you can begin to even address those kinds of questions, then you can begin to deal with problems like this in a way that is surprisingly effective. So, you know, it seems to me that one of the first things that we need to understand is that terrorism should not be described in the language that official counter-terrorist people describe them. You know, if you look at the literature, it's always described as incomprehensible. Terrorism is incomprehensible. Terrorism is beyond meaning. You know, why do they do it? They also talk about terrorism. You cannot stop terrorism. I don't know how many times you've heard. Terrorism cannot be stopped. You know, you have governments using the language. The question is, so not if, but when. In other words, this is going to happen. This is an incredibly powerful force that we have a language to describe. And if we have this narrative of terrorism that it cannot be described, it's beyond comprehension, it's beyond meaning, then they indeed become a very scary phenomenon. They do become a very scary phenomenon, but actually, they're just ordinary guys, doing some very bad things. But they are not beyond meaning, and they're not beyond our comprehension. They're people that we can deal with. And my argument in the book is that a mature society needs to learn to treat the threat of terrorism as a normal threat. By which I mean, not that we accept it, but it's a normal part of our life. And if we see it as being a normal part of our life, then we have the creative ability to minimize its destructive effects. That's the way it's a normal part of our life. We have to learn to live with it. And the way we respond to it is by doing everything we can to minimize its harmful, destructive effect on people. And once we do it, then we kind of bring it down to earth. It's a normal part of our life. It's not in the sky. It's not driven by divine intervention. It's something that we can meaningfully deal with by having a certain sense of meaning about our own life. And that's the key solution for dealing with this.
Before I go out and take some questions, I wanted to ask just one final question, and that's the not if but when kind of arguments is also used increasingly about climate change. And rather than it being scary guys, it tends to be ourselves who are seen to be the problems. You know, our consumption, our use of carbon, our driving of BMWs are seen to be the issue, the greatest threat to humanity. Is there a strong, would you draw a parallel between the terrorist threats and the impending climate threats that many people see?
Yeah, in one of the chapters of the book, I talk about what I call the triumph of possibilistic thinking. And possibilistic thinking is basically a form of thought that argues that if things can possibly go wrong, they will go wrong. And it's really another form of what-if thinking. And I think what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that once what-if thinking becomes institutionalized, then terrorism becomes the benchmark from which you then measure all these other very dangerous things. So you often hear politicians saying, like I think it was Don Primanola, one of these new health ministers, saying that child obesity is even a greater threat than global warming. And then some other idiot comes along and says, but global warming, you know, is a far bigger threat than terrorism. And that's no. And you had Gerald Navarro, the World Health Organization, saying, actually, the bird flu, it will kill more people than terrorists will kill, you know, sort of. And you got this kind of competing, you know, but they're all based on terrorism. Terrorism is a benchmark because we know how bad it is, and then we use all these other even greater threats, which that has the perverse effect of reinforcing what it's thinking. Because after a while, all these other threats also become threats that are beyond meaning. They're incomprehensible. We cannot possibly understand, the threat of global warming. And I think in that sense, it's a mutually reinforcing, sort of cultural sort of narrative.
Thanks very much. Now, I'll just take some time now to get some questions. If you just put your hands up, we have the mics to the side. Yeah. If I can get a question from the lady there on my right in green. If you put your hand up, Jen,
It's blue. Frank, I've got your book, but I haven't had a chance to read it. Just got it last night. One of the connections that people that I know keep on making about terrorism is the war that we're prosecuting in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And that we're very distant from the war and its consequences in its physical sense. And people somehow, I feel that we are guilty. And we're going to take, at some point, retribution is going to come. And the terrorism is explained in that way, that we are doing something that is going to be, reprimanded. Do you know what I mean? It's got that connection to what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, I get the guy in orange just behind you.
Hi. I was wondering if you could just say more about this idea that the political elite in this country is unsure about what it stands for, about what its future programme may be, and how that may possibly connect with some of the other debates we've had this weekend in relation to post-ideology and use of religious discourses and moralising.
And woman in white there.
I haven't read the book, so I have no idea if this question is somehow answered, but I'll do it anyway. What I find amazing about this whole conversation about terrorism is how they, whomever they might be, seem to be winning this battle of ideas. Just because our government seem to perceive it as that important, as that threatening. What I think is that if this threat is an ideological one, and if that is changing the way we act by acknowledging it, then does not mean that they're winning. Ultimately, it's not just about killing people, it's about then changing the way we see the world and the way we act. Can we change this? Can governments change this? Can this be changed at all?
Bill Furedi behind you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what Frank said, because I think we can actually go beyond normalising the threat. We also need to belittle it sometimes. I mean, we're dealing here with people who can't light gas canisters or light a shoe, or really do all the normal things that any self-respecting group of terrorists would do, i.e. conceal their intents and plans on most occasions. It's also the case that we can ridicule them in terms of their supposed ideological outlook, because in many instances, these self-styled radical Islamists sound rather more like social conservative Little Englanders wanting to blow up young women dancing in nightclubs because they're drinking and getting up to no good. And again, that kind of damages their importance, which I think the government has sadly fed into and inflated how significant they are. The final point I make is to remind people that it is impossible to bomb civilization out of existence from the outside, but it might be possible to severely damage it from the inside in terms of how the government reacts to these things, and that's what we need to guard against.
Thanks very much. The guy in brown at the front.
Yeah, you said that the war on terrorism was one of the first battle for ideas, and I was thinking that sounds quite familiar to what the war on communism was, and I was just wondering if you could say a bit about that.
Just like to take a cluster of questions at the front here, then I'll go out to the back. Yeah.
I was directly involved in July 7 bombs, and just a comment really which was quite amusing is the unknown unknowns. And I was actually admitted to hospital as one unknown. So I thought that was quite interesting. But just to further your point about the power of humanity, and absolutely that's what I've witnessed not only on that morning in the carriage, but 2 years on each and every day. And a lot of the officers and ambulance people who immediately rushed down to save one unknowns without prejudice, without ever thinking about the colour of my skin or my religion. And now I'm very proud to say some of my very dearest and closest friends. So once again, I think that's a great message of humanity, of how, if anything, rather than tearing my life apart, it's only enriched relationships with people who I otherwise would never have known.
Thanks very much. If you could pass the mic behind you to the gentleman there.
I'd just like to follow that up and say the meeting that we had in Leicester on Victoria Park with people from all religions was quite an emotional experience. It's not so acute as what we've heard, but I think it was very significant. The other thing I'd like to say, how bizarre that the Iranian president on one occasion challenged Bush to a theological debate. This must be the first time that this has been used in diplomacy. Obviously rather incompetent to answer, but this fits in with your idea that we don't know what we are, or at least Bush doesn't know what we are.
If you could put the mic to the person just to your left. Thank you. Yeah.
I don't want to.
You don't want to. Robin, if you could pass the mic to Richard Reynolds then.
Hi, yeah, you said it is becoming more of a sort of battle of ideas than perhaps once thought. I wondered, do you have any idea where the ideas are coming from? I mean, are they emergent from Islam, or do you think they're perhaps from somewhere else?
One question before we allow Frank to answer some of these questions, just from the lady there.
It's slightly related, because you mentioned very briefly that the public are less concerned about terrorism than the government. And certainly, and it's very anecdotal, but in my experience, they certainly are. And that you'd compare that to something like concerns around health or parenting, a number of issues which seem to have both a top-down and a purchase. This doesn't seem to have a purchase, and I wondered why that was, and whether that suggests it is far more elite-driven than maybe some other social problems.
Thanks very much. I'll go out to the back next. So Frank, would you like to respond to some of those questions first?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that this is posed as a battle of ideas, and in many respects the government would rather have a rerun of the Cold War, which is why almost every document mentions the Cold War, and they say these people are like the totalitarian movements of fascist Germany or Stalinist Russia. There's almost a kind of a fantasy-like desire to find this kind of tangible, coherent movement that you can argue against. And in the absence of that, what you're left with is a battle of ideas that is absolutely bizarre. I mean, one of the things I do, I have a very sad social life, so I kind of stay at home on Saturday nights and I read, official communiques and stuff like that. And one interesting thing that I find is that almost every communique on Islam written by Western governments, kind of talks about, Tony Blair is a very good example, talks about the fact that Islam is not about violence, and that goes into a long discussion about what Islam is. And I find it very, very interesting because, if I was a Muslim, I wouldn't really be interested in Tony Blair's views on my religion. I mean, he's not exactly a mullah with the right to kind of interpret, the real meaning, but there's this kind of real desire to tell the world that this is what Islam is really all about. And it's almost like there's a belief that, if they could, sort of demonstrate that Islam is actually a very peaceful religion, rather than something else, then, people would see the light, and that would be the end of the war. That's really the battle of ideas at the moment. It's basically an attempt to kind of provide a kind of a Tony Blair's version of goody-goody Islam, sort of as a way of dealing with these kind of things. And that's really not going to work. That's not going to win very, 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 very many ideas. And one of the sort of sad things that kind of comes out of that is that we then lose sight of the fact that by having a battle of ideas in this kind of sense, we're not really looking at what it is that drives people to terror. And that's what we should be asking. And if we did look at it, we can see that people adopt very nihilistic, very destructive attitudes towards the world, primarily by cultural forces that are inherent in our society. Right? You don't have to worry about peasants in the villages of Afghanistan. You don't have to worry about farmers in northern Iraq. A lot of this stuff comes from within Western societies: the hatred, the nihilism, the loss of meaning, the desire to lash out. All of these things come from there, and that, to answer your question, I think it's worth looking at what jihadists argue. Because I think actually, if you look at jihadist argument, if you want to do what I do on a Saturday night and look at Bin Laden videos and various other kind of stuff, you will find that quite often they haven't got the intellectual and the moral resources to develop arguments on the basis of their own tradition, their own religious tradition. It's not Islamic theology that turns sort of people into suicide bombers or terrorists. It's rather their relationship to late modernity. And as I made the point in another session, if you look at the most recent video of Bin Laden, he talks about Americans who consume too much. He talks about American having too many SUVs and using too much petrol. It's an anti-consumerist sort of argument that he's putting forward. Arguments that would go down really well or at a dinner table, a liberal dinner table in New York City, for that matter. So, I think we have to recognize that the problem isn't this radical Islam drawing upon centuries of theological insights. It's actually something very different.
Thanks. Right, if Mike could go to the back now, if you could just take Bruno Waterfield right in the middle there, who spoke at the immigration debate yesterday.
No, I think some of the comments you're making are fascinating. One of a document I've been trying to get my hand on for a long time, and made many kind of applications over open information laws for, is a document called the Common Lexicon, and it's a document that's put together at the EU level, but it's a kind of cooperative thing of national governments, and it's guidelines for government spokesmen after terrorist acts have been carried out. It gives various definitions of Islam. It's basically a way to create, I suppose, a kind of Tony Blair or George Bush version of friendly Islam, to make sure that government spokesmen do not counterpose the war on terror to Islam after terrorist acts. It's very, very fascinating because this is all woven into the media strategy after there should be a terrorist act. And this document, which acknowledges in the bits of it that are unclassified that a problem is that all of these ideas are deeply contested, is secret. You cannot get hold of it. It's used by all government departments, but this document is secret. And I think it shows a fascinating sensitivity about Islam and about the debate between, is there a link between Islam and terrorism? And just finally, very, very quickly, the Home Office has set up a new unit on radicalisation and recruitment, and looking at some of the texts around that. It is very, very interesting that when they talk about the problem of radicalisation and recruitment, they talk to all people, particularly young people, who may come into contact with ideas that are extremely opposed to globalisation.
Okay, can I get the guy in the beard with the white shirt there, please? The guy with the beard.
I ran an organization in New York called Against the War on Terror, and we spent a lot of time reading the stuff that comes out of Washington about terrorism. And one thing that kind of came across as you kind of watched Washington try and figure out what's going, both parties, in fact, figure out how they were relating terrorism, was that there was actually a kind of idea, although it was really more an idea underwriting the war on terror, but it was more an idea in the absence of ideas, which was security and survival. And what the war on terror seems to be is a way of elevating the quest for survival into a political principle and the end of politics. And I think what's interesting about this is that when that's the principle of politics, then that's one reason why you don't ever have to really do a rational assessment of the risk, because all they have to say is, we've mildly, ever so slightly increased your chances of survival, and therefore we've done what we set out to do. There is actually, therefore, a kind of idea to criticize within the war on terror, which is precisely this kind of, quite kind of miserablest kind of idea that really fills in the absence of any serious political ideas.
Put your hands up if you want to talk. Can I take the guy in black just to my left there?
Thanks. I take your point about Osama bin Laden's rhetoric not being theological in nature, the sense that it wouldn't be out of place around a liberal dinner table in New York. But to say that it is not theology misses the fact that most people who are swayed by the things that people like Osama bin Laden say, because they look at them as theologians, that their arguments are fundamentally founded on metaphysical principles rather than reason and evidence. And given that, don't you think that it's time to consider the possibility that when a terrible act of Islamic terrorism occurs, and the first response that we get from what we refer to as moderate Muslims is disavowal, is the simple statement, this is not Islam, Islam is peace, backed up by Tony Blair and everybody else that wants to create this image of Islam. Don't you think that it's time that we start addressing the fact that the people who follow this kind of ideology are sold on the idea? The people who follow this kind of ideology, if they have any questions, if they actually use reason to criticize the ideology, it's undercut and it's short-circuited by the fact that it's a metaphysical argument and you can't use reason against a metaphysical argument. Isn't it time that we recognize the fact that moderate Muslims or moderate religionists all over the place agree on a great deal with what we refer to as extremists? At the very least, they agree that there is an afterlife. They agree that the Quran and the Hadith should be taken seriously. They agree that there is a God who is interested in our daily affairs and intervenes in our daily affairs and cares about what we do. Don't you think we should be addressing those moderate views as well as the extremists?
Right, could you pass the mic to the person just in front of you there? Thanks.
What I haven't heard mentioned yet is a definition of what terrorism is. If it's violence for political means, the French government committed terrorism in New Zealand in the mid-1980s when it sent secret agents in to blow up the Rainbow Warrior. If we say it's non-state agents committing violence, then the military contractors that have been paid money to commit violence in Iraq, are they terrorists? Are we giving... I mean, thousands of people are dying in Iraq, and if depleted uranium is the next Agent Orange, it could be considered to be a chemical and a radioactive weapon, which sort of makes a joke of the justification of going into Iraq to prevent the use of chemical or radioactive weapons against people. I try and be rational, but I have emotional responses to this, and one of them is maybe they're justified to attack the system that's allowing violence to be committed in other parts of the world. And if we can't acknowledge that they might actually be justified, I think this debate is not really a debate.
Thanks. Could you take the mic right to the back there, please?
Thanks. Just to say on the idea about political Islam, I would question the view put by the guy over there a few moments ago, and I would say that actually I think that what you find, although lots of political Islamists, what they happen to be Muslims, In fact, the bedrock of their support is quite often based upon practical politics on the ground. Use the example of Hezbollah and Hamas. Over the summer, 2 Lebanese Christians from Lebanon fled the country and ended up in my college in my class. And as Christians, they say the entirety of the Christian community in Lebanon pretty much supports Hezbollah. And they support Hezbollah because Hezbollah support welfare support, and they provide schooling, and they've basically filled the vacuum in the Middle East, which is left by the dissolution of the communist parties in that area. And in fact, the basis of their actual support and the reasons that they have risen so dramatically are almost all political. And I've yet to hear Osama bin Laden, as an example, make statements which have been explicitly theoretical or theological, rather than make statements about national sovereignty and other really political and materialist views.
Thanks for that. I've only got time for one final question. You had a Munira Mirza there, just with a hand up there.
I think it is really important to stress the point that it's not about, the they is not just Muslims or actually even Muslim extremists, because I've done some research with students, Muslim and non-Muslim students, and generally the reaction is quite consistent across both groups. They are very anti-Western in a lot of their outlook. They're very concerned about Western hubris, so-called Enlightenment values. I just think that the way in which the political class in this country look at the problems, it must be some kind of external group or some external force that's challenging us. These are very homegrown problems, and young people, in fact young people generally, who express these views, they're not likely to become terrorists. The vast majority will not become terrorists. There is a security problem here, but I'm more concerned with the cultural problem, the broader cultural problem, and that can't be dealt with in terms of the risks and security discourse that we have.
Thanks very much for that. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions now, so Frank, if you'd like to come back on some of those and make a few remarks.
Can I make a few unpopular remarks that I'm going to get lynched for? Number one, although I'm against the war in Iraq, and I don't like the war in Afghanistan either, I don't accept the point that terror is a retribution in some shape or form for something that was done elsewhere. I think that most of the acts of terror that we've experienced in Europe are driven by impulses that are, to some extent, not even linked to Palestine or any of those kinds of issues, except in a rhetorical, sort of justificatory sense. They would occur even if Palestine, Israel never existed, even if the West has never invented those places, because there are very powerful destructive urges within Western societies that lead towards that kind of dynamic. And I think that we have to recognize that it's not just merely Islamic organizations or organizations that have that kind of affiliations, but a lot of other organizations that are moving in that kind of particular direction. And I think that's an important point to make, because the argument that somehow these acts are kind of the legacy of some kind of revenge or some kind of sort of justice that's kind of being carried out, I think is really smacks of very slothful Western liberalism, self-guilt and self-loathing that misses out the picture entirely. I also think that it's entirely wrong for Westerners or for non-Muslims to tell Muslims what their religion is. For two reasons. Not because I'm sort of a relativist, but for a very simple reason: it doesn't work. If I'm a Muslim and a non-Muslim tells me what my religion is, I will laugh at it. I think, who does Blair think he is, telling me what a moderate as opposed to an extreme Muslim is? It simply doesn't really work. So I think that's one reason why I think it's wrong. Secondly, it's actually, when you do that, it's an admission of ideological, intellectual and moral defeat. The very fact that you have to resort to those kind of tactics indicates that you spend far more time trying to kind of cleverly, sort of manipulate the good Muslims from the bad Muslims, than actually saying this is what we stand for. And I think that if Brian and Blair spend as much time and as much intellectual energy projecting, what we're about, what is the alternative, as they are telling the Muslims about what they're about, I think that you would find that the so-called battle of ideas would begin to resemble ideas rather than what they are at the moment, which are kind of very empty sort of intentions. And I think that is something that we really need to sort of understand. Just one final point. I really do think that the government has got no agenda in the way that it's often projected. Obviously, got an agenda, but not in the way that it's kind of projected. And it's really summed up by a word that the American government uses to describe they. In the recent couple of years, they talk about they as what they call the universal adversary. That's the term that they use. No longer terrorists, but they're the universal adversary. And I think that kind of sort of inchoate, diffuse, meaningless term, the universal sort of adversary, which they mean anybody who doesn't like George Bush or doesn't like is symptomatic of the fact that deep inside they are at a loss to kind of point the finger and even see in a vague sense just what it is that they are up against, what it is that they are fighting. Which doesn't mean to say that we haven't got this new welfare state being created, the new Keynesianism, which is a security state being created, which obviously sort of has expanded, and all you got to do is go to any American airport and see how security has become a job creation scheme for poor white working class Americans, and millions of people are now strutting around with guns in their hand, looking sort of impressive and basically picking their nose and not doing very much more for the economy or for society. But that is the unintended consequence of something rather than the main cause of the process that has occurred.
Thank you very much, Frank, for starting a debate that I think is a very important one.